There's another conversation for another day, perhaps. Actually, if you're interested, we could chat about simulations and comparing and contrasting our work somewhat. Um, but yeah, I've been reading
Yeah,
also.
that could be fun.
I've been reading some papers actually on going back to the main topic for today. So we're discussing whether, effectively, whether China is a fascist state and how we can measure that. But I haven't had a huge amount of time since we last spoke to read about this. But I have got some papers up on that I'll have up on the screen um, while we're chatting about this. So
Yeah,
um,
100%. And I've been doing what I can on my end, although albeit less intensive than I planned on due to
it's always this
work.
way.
But yeah, so let me
Yeah,
really
yeah.
fast now that
Sure,
this
sure.
thing's
If it,
restarted.
yeah,
I'll
if
be
you have
switching channels.
cool, cool. If you have to jump off and on again, then don't worry about it. Yeah.
All right, yeah, so give me 1 second. That sound better?
Oh wow, yeah, okay. That's well, actually, I mean, it's a bit, there's a little bit more treble. If you can mix the two equalizers, it could be a bit broader range. But
Oh yeah, I don't know how any of this crap works. Like all my audio settings for microphones are all on default since I don't know how they work.
and then it also goes through. I mean, like Discord automatically has these noise suppressors and compressors implemented, and so you get it working for one app, and then I have the same thing with my webcam when I'm going on Zoom, and I've been using it in
Mhm.
OBS. Then they don't get on with each other. So it's the same thing with microphones and yeah. I mean, Linux will have its problems for you as well. I mean, it's nothing's ever perfect, but yeah. Thank you for this. You got up super early this morning to come on stream and chat with me about this topic, and I find it kind of really a fascinating topic. But it goes as much into the question of what fascism is as to what China is, right?
Yeah. Um, and that's Internet Archive is done. That's not good. Yeah, and I guess that's where I think I'd like to start with, right? Is kind of getting a baseline of what fascism is, because one of the things we've talked about in the past is that there's a propensity people have to just have this archetype of fascist Nazi or fascist this or fascist that, or when you talk to people, they will conflate authoritarianism with fascism. So it's kind of a mindfucky word because there's been so much, for lack of a better word, just misinformation about what this ideology is, and it's not really. I'm not saying disinformation because I mean there's some of that, but it's just generally people have a very conflated or unrealistic view of what this is. So when I say something like China as a fascist state, it can be a little like, what the fuck you're talking about. So I think that's probably a good starting point before going into the details of why
Mm-hmm.
China is a fascist state. I mean, I have my mind open on it. But it's, I don't know. It's just the more I learn about it, the more I'm convinced by it.
Yeah, but sometimes isn't that that can be an issue when you're dealing with labeling anything or categorizing anything. That if you try to look for too many positive cases, or you get into a bias sometimes if you really feel that something is the case, and you start seeing it everywhere, right?
Mhm.
And so there is a risk that you don't ask the question, well, why is China not a fascist state as much as why it is? Um,
Yeah, that's a fair point.
You know, I mean, there's also the point, and I think this is a fair one, that some people will see fascism and communism as mutually exclusive.
Mhm.
And I think that is definitely a fallacy. You can see how a fascistic state, or state even with you could say fascistic tendencies, so you don't go the full hog, um, could also be effectively, or at least calling itself a communist state. I was actually having this discussion and debate with a friend of mine in the gym yesterday. A lot of these discussions seem to happen because he was complaining about capitalism, and I was saying, "Well, give me an example of a country that's a perfect capitalist state." And of course, he went to the USA, and I said, "Well, if it was the case in the USA, you wouldn't have the Affordable Care Act, for example, even ever in place, because it couldn't happen under a perfect capitalist state, right? If you want to go down that route." And the idea is that, in a sense, you know about Plato's forms, right? This notion of a perfect ideal of something that effectively can't really exist. And so in political science or political philosophy, you could also suggest that these ideologies, they're perfect form, Platonic forms, but they never actually exist in practice in their perfect form. They're always kind of an imperfect, rough, thereabouts example. So I definitely think that's applicable with regards to with regards to communism, fascism, capitalism, liberalism, all these fun isms. And that's one of the risks of kind of obsessing too much over them and saying, well, China has to be perfectly fascistic to be a fascist state. But it's the same thing with the other isms, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's the that's the big issue with this, right? Is how do you give anything the label that is even like a capitalist, even for like what is capitalism, or what is a Western country? What is liberalism? Like these are not rigid things. There's a lot of leeway because no two things under the sun are the same, right? So it can be tricky. That's the easy. I guess there's no beating around the bush on that. It can just be tricky because if you're not careful, like you're saying, you can talk yourself into anything.
Exactly. Bring it back on topic then. I mean, I've got the Ur-Fascism Wikipedia open right now. This has got a really nice, concise list of properties of a fascist state. So this is a bit more refined rather than having some vague idea of fascism. Let's stick to this definition. And then you can also get a wiki up on your screen. We can go through this a little bit, right?
100%. Yeah, and I guess to start off with that before reading the points, there's a preface he gives to it that I feel. So Ur-Fascism, to the uninitiated, it's an essay that was written by Umberto Eco. He's a medieval historian who has a background with fascism as being a teenage boy during the Mussolini Boogaloo. And he wrote an article, I forget if it was in the 90s or 80s.
1995, according to the Wikipedia.
The 90s then.
Yeah.
He wrote this essay that he called Ur-Fascism, or Universal Fascism. It's kind of like, as he explains it, as a kind of his trying to break down fascism as this family of ideas and to give different kind of like call signs or characteristics of a fascist ideology. But one of the things what he's doing explaining is that he's not trying to create this checklist of check all the checks and it is fascist. No, what he's trying to do is explain different characteristics that things within the family of fascism can have, and you don't need all of them, or you don't even need a lot of them to be considered a fascist ideology. It's just having that in mind before going into it. I feel like this essay gets used a lot, but that aspect of the essay sometimes doesn't get as much attention as it does, which is he's explaining what the hell these points even mean and what he's trying to do with these points.
Okay, so just to clarify, I really appreciate this point because this isn't something that's apparent on the wiki, and just to make a point of this, you've read this in depth, and I haven't. I've just been looking at the wiki effectively for this. So instead of it being kind of a sliding scale with these points and some kind of scoring system where you give these kind of a gradient of scores, there's actually kind of a threshold, in his opinion, that you reach a number of these points and then you fall into the category of being fascist. And so to compare this with in paradoxes, I compared this the other day with you, right? That this is compared to the heap paradox, where you have a 1 grain of rice, you say it's not a heap. You have 10,000 grains of rice in a pile, you'd call that a heap. And as you take the grains of rice away, at some point it ceases to be a heap. And there's a vagueness there. So this paradox highlights vagueness. And there are a number of solutions. One, you can say there was a sliding scale, and you say, well, it's 60% heap. Or you say there's some, frankly, arbitrary threshold, but you might want to argue for where the balance of that threshold is, and that's, of course, what I assume that was written in the essay. So to be clear here...
Yeah, actually, to probably just not beat around the bush, I mean, the 2 paragraphs right before that he lists the points, I think is, if you mind, I can just read them. They're not very long.
Yeah, great.
Explains himself perfectly. Anyway, so fascism became an all-purpose term because one can eliminate from a fascist regime one or more features, and it will still be recognizable as fascist. Take away imperialism from fascism, and you have Franco and Salazar. Take away colonialism, and you have the Balkan fascism of the Ushtes. Add to the Italian fascism a radical anti-capitalism, which never much fascinated Mussolini, and you have Ezra Pound. Add a cult of Celtic mythology and Grail mysticism, completely alien to official fascism, and you have one of the most respected fascist gurus, Julius Evola. But in spite of this fuzziness, I think it is possible to outline a list of features that are typical of what I would like to call Ur-Fascism or eternal fascism. These features cannot be organized into a system. Many of them contradict each other, and are also typical of other kinds of despotism or fanaticism. But is it enough that one of them be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it? Um, I think that explains it better than I could. But to just add on to that, it's like the points that he's outlining here, and this is why like I always give that I really push that disclaimer that I have with this essay is that he's not trying, like, these are not just checkpoints, checking the box and then we score the grade at the end. It's trying to identify something within a family of ideas, which is how he explains fascism. I mean, earlier on in this essay, he explains kind of like the way you can think about fascism as like a type of board game, where something like chess and checkers are two different games, but they're part of the same kind of family. Like there's a lot of significant differences between the two games, but they both kind of fit within that same kind of family of board games.
This ties really nicely to another region of philosophy, which is especially late Wittgensteinian philosophy and his notion of language games and the meanings of words. So he contrasted the meaning of his philosophy of language with that of Augustine. And Augustine had this, effectively it was just a predication as a form of definition. So you state the meaning and you can write the meaning into a dictionary, and that's exactly the meaning of a word, is something that can just be predicate a word, and that word has its meaning in that regard to nothing else. Wittgenstein described effectively what you're describing, and is described in this essay, that it doesn't have to have all the predications at once, right? And it often depends on the context and how it's used. You could have an informal way in which the word fascism is used. You could have then a more prescriptive way here. And so in a sense, the essay is actually in quite an intelligent way describing it in a prescriptive way, but not in a way that you have to score every point to pass through. But he did, just thinking about the quote you referred to, mention the fuzziness. And this appeals to me, thinking how I can apply a fuzzy logic to the argumentation. And in that sense, it isn't that it doesn't score it, it's the way in which it scores it, right? And so then it is appealing to a kind of a sliding scale, because that's the nature of fuzzy logic, that you have, it kind of becomes 60-70% fascism. So I think he may actually be appealing to that way of thinking about it. But then in general language, we don't talk in probabilities, and we say, well, it's effectively a fascist state at that point. So maybe you want to go through like some of the ways in which he does measure whether it is fascist or not fascist, how you think that applies to China, like the big three, shall we say?
Yeah, 100%. So I mean, one of the issues is, I guess I don't want to just read through this whole list, but I think quite a few points apply to the Xi Jinping's China. But if you're trying to distill it down to the biggest three, it would probably be the selective populism, the culture tradition, and the rejection of modernism. And there's others I can add to that list from here, but those are probably the biggest three.
Okay, can we let's clarify the meanings of some of these words, or at least how we want to use them.
100%.
So what do you mean by modernism in this case?
So modernism, in the sense of, I mean, a lot of it comes down to the rejection of a lot of the Enlightenment and liberalism. Honestly, probably the best example of this is I can find this later, but Mussolini's treatise on it and his Doctrine of Fascism talks about this quite a bit. But the idea that the world is kind of moving away from peoples is a big one, or moving away from the state or the people and becoming more individualistic, is a big trope that you see in pretty much every fascist state. The idea that turning away of the individual freedom for freedom of the state. Um,
Well, that's very much in line with many strands of socialism as well, right?
yes, but it's a little bit different because with let's say you go with something with like a purely Marxist, not Marxist-Leninist, but purely Marxist, where it's not quite a stateless society in the sense of someone like an anarchist would be saying, but the idea that the organization is the people of a class, or a class, or when you have class-based ideologies, they're very universal in nature, and the idea that like nationalities are kind of just a manufactured illusion, and that it's in a very internationalist ideology versus something like fascism, which is a very nationalist ideology. It comes from, it springs from national syndicalism. So it's the idea that the people of a country, the nation, the people of the nation, that is what forms the state, and it is the freedom of that state versus individual freedoms or freedom of a class in particular.
Okay, there's some bias in that regard. There's a bit there's less, yeah. The identity is different in the case of fascism. So that's how you differentiate between a like a Marxist state and a fascist state then.
Yeah, and I mean, part of it too is kind of like, I mean, part of rejecting modernism too is kind of the idea of the rejection of what is like the Western capitalistic worldview. I mean, that is something that fascist states have always rejected against. It wasn't full private socialization of everything. The government didn't take control of all private industry, but in the sense of capitalism as the way that it is, was taken away, and it became very corporatist, which is something that China is openly corporatist, even though nobody uses that word for them for some reason.
Can you develop on that a little bit more? One of the papers I read on this actually argued that against China being a fascist state because it wasn't quite corporatist as you'd expect in a fascist state. So this is one of the criticisms actually.
Well, I'm curious on what their argumentation was around it, because like if you look at how their economic system is set up, private industry is entirely directed and in cahoots with party leadership, not state leadership, party leadership, and that's a very important distinction.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, you were linking the party with. Okay. I mean, as I said, I didn't read these in enough detail to really push back here because I do want to push back on you a little bit. There's certainly some instances. I mean, that's why I asked you to give your top three, because there are other cases where on this list it's relatively weak and you could argue against it. But
100%, yeah.
I mean, another criticism, of course, and I think this does make. The thing is, effectively, these are all premises, right? And you don't need every premise to be fulfilled. The overall argument that a state is fascist to hold, right? So it's not that it's contingent on every of these premises, but there's just enough of them to be fulfilled. So,
well, I mean, and again, going back to, I would say the last sentence that he says right before he says it is, but it's enough that one of them to be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it, and I think that's just a good way of thinking about this. It's not really.
Well, actually, it's just to push back on that. I think that's going too far, because you could find this probably as a description of the majority of states, and you will end up. I mean, okay, you could say any state's got the potential to become fascist, and maybe there is some truth in that.
I mean, yes, that's a given.
Exactly. So
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, but the way I agree that that is a very hyperbolic, and taken verbatim is an untrue statement. But I mean,
I'm just looking at number one here, the cult of tradition.
Yeah.
There are definitely a lot of times. I mean, I'm from UK originally, and in Britain, where the leading party, and Labour's doing this right now, or even the US as well with flags, and the US has appealed to its constitution, and it often leads to into contradictions that people get frustrated by and sensitive to. So much so, I probably shouldn't give too many examples. Uh, and
Well,
so
if you want to
you,
argue that a fascist movement is trying to take control of the United States, I mean, you don't have to argue with me
yeah,
about
but
that.
I'm
But
saying even in the UK under the Labour government, and I don't like people throwing around the F word when it comes to that. And even with Trump, I would call him proto-fascist. He's bordering on it, of course, but he has to be successful to really be a fascist state. And there's so many signs of hope that actually I'd just say it's proto-fascist, where you are having this clustering. There's a word with C that the author colloquiation, or however you pronounce it. But I would say
yeah,
clustering is effectively a synonym. A clustering around fascist tendencies. There is a pull, there is a kind of magnetism towards it right now in the US. That's fair enough to suggest. But you could also, as I say, with the cult of tradition, I can go to various countries around Europe and say, okay, well, I can clearly tick that box. And therefore, you're suggesting that the clustering process has already started. I'd say that's a little premature. I think you need more than just one of these. But maybe,
well, yeah, because it's not just one of these, and it's also just not that they have traditionalism. It's what is the nature of that traditionalism? Like, how's it being manifest? How's it functioning? And that's where it becomes a little different.
yeah, exactly. In China's case, it's different. I'm just saying the author that particular sentence the author wrote, I think, weakens his not his overall argument, but the application of this system of assessing whether a state is fascist or not. Because one or two of these you can find in most states. Although that is suggestive that fascism is omnipresent risk in any country, and we should appreciate the values that we often have that we don't, such as liberalism and the freedom to have this conversation that we have right now. So yeah, I think it's a reason to appreciate that there is always that risk, but I think that risk is very small if it's one or two of these actually. So in China's case, though, there are a lot more of these, and I do agree with you on that. Although I would say number two, the rejection of modernism, and it means the Enlightenment. That's a little bit approaching a straw man argument if it's really contingent on that, because it's from a Western perspective. It's like, well, okay, you're often going to find away from the West non-Western cultures and variants of how we've seen our culture, and of course we like and are biased towards our own cultures. But just on that point alone, and there's some kind of difference without looking in more detail at that difference. The difference itself isn't the problem, is it? It's how it's applied and such like. So I think I'm not too keen on the notion of bringing the Enlightenment in here in terms of what modernism is. It needs to be a bit broader, otherwise it's going to be biased towards Western societies.
Well, I mean, going on the traditionalism aspect, because I will hit on this a little bit, because there has been a strong return to traditionalism over the past 15 years in China, actually probably stretching longer. There's a great I didn't know if I sent you this, but in the thing I put out with the pragmatic papers, there's a segment I quoted from Dr. Kevin Rudd, who's the ambassador to the United States from Australia, former Australian Prime Minister. He spent much of his political career as a diplomat to China. That is his realm of expertise, is the political environment in China. He's had personal conversation with Xi Jinping many times, including before he was a big Whig. He met him and had his most intimate experiences with him when he was a mayor of Xinjiang, I believe. I don't remember off the top of my head. Very interesting fella, but he's written several articles, including and a very good book came out a couple of years ago that really hammers in on it. There's a section on that that, if you mind, as a paragraph, I want to read that.
Yeah,
But Xi Jinping has made cultivating nationalism an even stronger priority, leveraging an increasingly sophisticated propaganda apparatus that has seamlessly fused the imagery of the modern CCP with the national mythology of a proud and ancient Chinese civilization. This has included the rehabilitation of Confucianism, once dismissed by the CCP as a reactionary and anti-communist, as part of the restoration of the party's emphasis on the uniqueness of China's national political philosophy. According to the official line, a long-standing continuity of benign hierarchical governance, as repeated by Confucianism, is what differentiates China from the rest of the world. The shorthand form of Xi's political narrative is simple. China's historical greatness across its dynastic histories always lay in strong authoritarian hierarchical Confucian governments. By corollary, China's historical greatness was never a product of Western liberal democracy or any Chinese variation of it. By extension, China's future national greatness can only lie in the continued adaptation of its indigenous political legacy derived from the hierarchical tradition of Confucian communist state, of the Confucian communist state. I think that's a great paragraph and very insightful from Rudd, because there has been a strong return to traditionalist ideas within China, especially under Xi.
Okay, but this is exactly what I mean. This I think in this the you know let's call it a checklist, even though it doesn't necessarily it's just overall it's a kind of effectively a checklist. I really find this particular notion of appealing to tradition. It's far too vague, and frankly, most countries will do this in terms of their national identity. And lo and behold, that's China's tradition and history and culture, especially during an era in which it's quite successful. Of course, then there's going to be an appeal to those traditions. And the fact that it's effectively quite authoritarian is unsurprising. And of course, you can consider fascism like a very small subset of authoritarian regimes. But that doesn't, it's a weak implication. That is to say that just because it's authoritarian doesn't mean to say it's a fascist, even though you can say the reverse, of course. So the fact that it appeals to an authoritarian tradition, and it's this tradition aspect, which is part of Ur's fascism, I find that could be applicable for many countries. And this isn't a criticism of Rudd here. He's making a very astute point, and like you say, has incredible wealth of experience himself directly with China and the Chinese leadership. I think he's really one of the Western commentators to read and listen to on this. But to use that notion to really support the idea that it's this notion of fascism, I'd say some of these, I could score the list itself in terms of which ones I find most effective in terms of scoring fascism with regards to China. I don't think.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that because I will fight on the point of traditionalism because I think it depends on the type, like how it's being manifest. I think that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm very hesitant to use this as just like a checklist, because
that we both agree
use some of these. Well, I mean, you can use some of these points could be very easily flipped around and used in a non-destructive, non-corrosive way.
Well, exactly.
Some of them are pretty, like the machismo and a few other of these points are fairly a one-way street. But but the reason I'm kind of pinning on traditionalism is because it's not just that China is trying to bring back and have a traditional resurgence and things. It's how it's doing it and why it's doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not just tradition in isolation. It's the way in which tradition is used is weaponized almost. And I think there is truth behind that. So I'm just wanting to push back on being too broad of the criticism or saying that something is a criticism. I think there's a very Western-centric aspect to this word fascism that I frankly have a little bit of an issue with, although it is quite open in how it has that Western bias. And of course, the term originates in the West, so maybe it should have that Western bias. But in terms of evolving the term into a more useful one, I think it may need to step away from that. So, for example, number 2, the rejection of modernism, the concept needs to be broadened. And the cultural tradition, I'm using the numbering system here, I don't know if it was numbered in the text. I think that links with number 7 quite strongly. So the cultural tradition, when used for this obsession with a plot, and the plot thing is really interesting because if you read, recently I've been reading a lot on popularism. There's an article coming out in the Pragmatic Papers that I've just written on linking game theory with basically political psychology and combating popularism. I've read far too much about it recently. And this is a key thing that comes up in popularism: obsession with plot and hyping up of an enemy threat. And they use that to victimize themselves, and they use it as a vessel to power. Now, if you use
Yeah.
tradition, like your tradition's being threatened, that can be part of the plot. And I think that's a key ingredient, that your tradition's always under threat. So we need to maintain it, and to maintain it, we need they need to be authoritarian, and that leads into fascism. So in isolation, I think 1 and 7 need to be combined for it really to start to score towards fascism. And arguably that's the case in China, but I have to push back here a little bit, because when I read, she is also pushes back and openly speaks about fascism, and in also in relation to the Han ethnicity. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Um, and he has openly discussed this. There's a threat to the state of ethno-fascism in China. He openly refers to it and speaks against this. So is he just paying lip service to this, and in practice is actually working within that form of ethno-fascism, or is there a reason to kind of think, okay, well, this goes against the notion of having a plot of victimizing, because he's saying no, there is no need to victimize, or say that this ethnic group is under threat. And to the contrary, the threat is actually people who are trying to be fascistic with this idea. So, do you think there's any validity to this argument?
A little bit yes and a little bit of no. So with the so going back with the idea of like the threat of ethno-fascism popping up, um, I Xi is a very intelligent cookie. You don't get to a position where you're at in that nation without being a very, very sharp guy. And I do believe he knows a little bit of what he's doing and the fire that he's playing with. But then again, there's a little bit of disingenuousness with, if I don't know exactly what he said verbatim, but if I'm assuming you're capturing the meaning correctly, there's a little bit of disingenuousness about that, because that kind of ethno-nationalism has been stoked by him individually. With the and it's not the, and we've talked about this before, but it's what Xi Jinping's Hanification is not trying to create a genetically pure Hanification, but is trying to create a culturally cohesive Han Chinese state. And that's a very dangerous thing to play with, because people can take that to whatever extreme they want to on the individual level. So I mean, yes, I can see him saying that, giving that warning about that ethno-fascism from a more genetic, not deistic sense. But I mean, he's playing with cultural homogeneity, and that's always a very dangerous thing. And that is a consistent fascistic trait across everybody. When you can point towards any fascist state, there was an attempt for cultural homogeneity. How they achieved that was very different.
Okay, I mean, openly admit I'm at this point still manning your argument to some extent, but it is also an interesting, at least on the surface, it appears paradoxical. Do you not think that a country requires some homogeneity culturally for it to be healthy and functional? So he may not be pushing for actually a kind of single culture and a single ethnicity, but some greater level of cohesion, and he sees some ethnicities within China as just not compatible with that overall culture.
Yeah, I mean, you can see what's happening with in Xinjiang, yeah, right, with the Uyghurs. What's happening in the Chinese occupied area of Mongolia. Tibet was always a great example, and why Taiwan is seems like such an existential threat to their national project. Because like with the Taiwan thing in particular, it's very interesting, because it's very confusing on why the hell Taiwan is such a big deal. It's a small state. Yeah, it has a lot of semiconductors on it, but it doesn't seem to merit the attention that it gets by China and by the United States, frankly, on the surface. But the reason why it's so important to China is because of this idea of national unity and the idea of the national unity of one people under one country, which is why, like, even though they have a lot of lip service for Marxist-Leninism, and they use a lot of Marxist-Leninist ideology, they really aren't fundamentally Marxist-Leninist. Is like the very core idea of like abandoning nationality and focusing on like a unified class and being an internationalist. They don't have any of that.
Yeah,
It's
for
about,
sure. I mean,
yeah.
can I just add to that point, right? Because one of
Mhm.
the checklist for fascism here is that that you have to be expansionist and militaristic. That seems to be a key, or one of the ingredients that can really say, okay, this is a likely fascistic state. And as you say, you need a few of these for it to really be to reach the threshold. But that's also in some ways something that aligns actually with communism, right? There's this continual revolution to try and make the whole world a happy socialist utopia. So if China's not that, then it also goes against it being. I mean, this discussion today is not about whether China's communist or not, but that's also an interesting discussion. But it kind of goes against both the fascistic aspect of China as well as the communist aspect of China, because they're,
Mhm.
in a way, they're kind of isolationist, right? Or at least they appear on the surface that they don't want to expand except for their own.
Well, they're not. I wouldn't say they're not isolationist, because China is definitely not isolationist, but they're not internationalist.
Yeah, I mean, when I say isolationist, I don't mean to say that they don't try and influence other countries. Clearly, they do. I mean, look at sub-Saharan Africa as well as in Europe. I mean, I have an article. It's quite interesting what's going on in Europe now, which is what I wanted to segue into towards the end of this
Mhm.
discussion. But China's saying, "Hey, we're not selling one of these main hubs, these main ports in Greece that it has complete ownership of." It doesn't own that by accident or think it's profitable. It's because of the leverage, right, that it has over Europe. So clearly, China seeks leverage over, over areas that it considers geopolitically useful. But it's not. You could argue it's not doing that for the sake of power, but for the sake of self-preservation, because it knows then it can hold, frankly, other countries hostage. Um, and link its own success with other countries' success. So if it falls, then everyone else falls, right? So it still, in the end, comes back to its own self-preservation.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, I agree. Like in the sense that there's been dealings its external face is always has an internal focus. I mean, the the primary goal, the number one goal objective that stands above all others within China is the preservation of the party, of party control. Everything else is a derivative of that. And there's different ways that they could have been done, and they've decided to go down this route. But all their decisions can be traced down to that point of uniparty control. And so yes, I guess in that sense, yes, everything that they've been doing is. You can say there's an isolationist streak. I wouldn't want to say isolate. I don't like the word isolationist, because
Okay,
I think it has
self-preserving, shall we say? I mean,
self-preserving. I think is a better word
yeah,
for it. Yes.
and that is distinctly non-fascist, and ultimately, it's doesn't really fit in within the framework of communism either very well. So it's
Well, I mean, it kind of does, because with communism, right? It's the depending on which brand, but if you're going with the Marxist-Leninist ideology of it, you want the preservation of
Oh, I'm not. Yeah,
internal revolution.
for sure. The preservation is it's contingent on the preservation to then start spreading the word, right? But
Mhm.
just because you're trying to self-preserve doesn't mean to say that's your next intent. And that next intent,
Yeah.
the thing is, it's very ambiguous. And I think a lot of these issues with regards to China, and why, to be fair to China, I don't want to start. I mean, I personally wouldn't label it. I'd say it's got maybe some fascist traits, and more so than many Western democracies by a long way. But I don't want to. I don't know if I think it's still at this level of ambiguity.
Mm.
And one of the reasons there's this level of ambiguity is because it's so hard to read the intent behind the maneuvers. And this is one great example, right? Is this a secret way or a quiet way to gain power in sub-Saharan Africa or Europe, and then later on start pushing ideologically its views. I mean, for example, through the ownership of TikTok, right? It's tried to. I think there's been they try not to allow too much anti kind of China propaganda on there or anything like this or messaging, but at the same time they're not pushing videos about Mao, or at least not from my understanding, videos about Mao and Maoism or anything like this to try and promote their own ideology. It's just again about the self-preservation. So is this maybe just one step towards then, frankly, expansionist, ideologically expansionist procedure and actions? It could well be, right? And so then, in hindsight, we would see this and go, well, clearly these were, expansionist moves, but they're not necessarily expansionist moves. And I think every country in the world is trying to self-preserve. That's almost like an emergent biological property of nations themselves that. It's a means to survival, and it's an evolutionary aspect of nations, right?
Yeah. And this is where I would, and this again, this is obviously something that we're different on, because I do think they've crossed the threshold where you can call them a fascist state. And in fact, I'd say they're probably right now in existence the most textbook, or maybe not textbook is the right word for this, and actually textbook is not the right word for this, but they're probably the most fascistic state in existence right now. They're not the most extreme state in existence right now, but I would call them the most fascistic. And if anyone merits the labeling of that word, I believe it's the CCP.
Okay, but you could then argue against that and say, well, it might be the most fascistic state, but there aren't really many. It's a historical term
but
now.
But to respond to what you're saying before directly, I mean, one of the things is how China has been facing the world is, I mean, as far as what their intentions are, I mean, they say them. These intentions are not kept secret. I mean, that's one thing that, I mean, you can look at, for example, here in the United States, with its fascist movement, with MAGA, is they've been very clear what their intentions are, and China has as well. Xi Jinping has been very clear what their intentions are and where they want China to be on the global stage, and they don't want China to just be this North Korea of the world. They want China to be the leading power in the world. Not in the sense of the United States.
No, so I have to push. But
yeah.
It's a country of a completely different size and magnitude, firstly. And secondly, North Korea clearly, in terms of its own survival, made some mistakes with regards to not trying to create some leverage globally. And so maybe China sees that, or she sees that. And I'm not arguing that it's clearly not, if by Ur's definition of fascism, clearly not a fascist state. I'm just saying it's too ambiguous to really label it that way. This is another one. I'm looking at these definitions again. So you have the contempt for the weak, right? And so you could say that the suppression of ethnic minorities in China, which is of course horrendous, and I don't say that that's a good thing, is a contempt for the weak. It could be perceived that way. But it could also be perceived that they see it as a threat to the state. There's a fragmentation of the Chinese state, and for that reason that they're doing this. So it's a lot of these points here are about intent. They're not about the action, but about the intent behind the action. And this is one of the tricky things with this, right? Is then you need to be clear about what the intent behind the action is, and if you're not, then you can't really say whether it ticks one of these boxes, right? So like fear of difference, that's another example given, right, under Ur's fascism. So it's a fear of different cultures and such like. And again, you can argue this both ways. So I'm not saying that it's clear one way or another, but the ambiguity is rife in this methodology, surely.
I mean, yeah. I mean, of course, there's a level of ambiguity to all of this, but what I'm going to pick up what you're saying about the intent, and that's why when earlier when I was talking about traditionalism, why I was harping on that quite a bit, is because their intent has been fairly clear. These are not things that we have to guess about. Like Xi Jinping, we don't have to guess what his intent is. We might try to guess what what their worldview is, and as far as current events or things that are happening at the moment, but what their goals are and their intentions are. These are things that they've stated. China's I mean, what is it? The century of, I forget the exact terminology off the top of my head. Century of humiliation, I believe, is what they use.
Oh, right, yeah, because they basically didn't have a navy and so struggled to maintain
Yeah,
their power.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a, I mean, I'll quote Mussolini on this. The fascist doctrine that is best suited for the tendencies and feelings of a people which, like the Italians, after lying fallow during centuries of foreign servitude, are now reasserting itself in the world. That is almost perfectly maps onto what China's trying to do right now.
Mm-hmm.
Is there is a sense of national resurgence that Xi is trying to capture for his national project of we were suppressed, and you can point to various different enemies that they had. The Soviet Union for a long time was their great contradiction. I mean, first was the United States, but then the Soviet Union and Chinese became very antagonistic, and that doesn't get talked about enough. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, that did major damage. That caused major waves in every nation of the world, including China, and that was one of, if not the reason why China seemed to pivot away from the trajectory they seemed to be going as far as liberalizing, was the breakup of the Soviet Union. But after that, it's great ideological contradiction shifted back to the United States again.
You've made loads of points in one go, actually, that I find quite interesting. I mean, going back to your original one about this, recollection of history, and this, of course, again, I mean, to support your point, like this obsession with plot is the suggestion of this threat because of the threat historically. Look what Western nations did to us. So this fits this framework, right? So I can see this point, but at the same time, I think China fits in is a subset of these countries that have had a history of supremacy in globally, and it's a genuine one. It's a fair point. It's not an exaggeration, right? And so that fits in with countries like Turkey has this ethos, this history of we were once a great power and we will be a great power again because of the Ottomans. Britain also has this bias, and so this bias to tradition. A lot of people remember the British Empire, or wrongly remember. They don't really understand it, and so they think it was a good thing. And so there's this kind of when a country has had such power. I mean, I use it as an example because I know it well, but and of course, it's my home country. There's a lot of things I think are great about the UK, but this is definitely not one of them. That because it has a history of having this dominance, it often rears its head afterwards, and you can never really get rid of it because it's such an appealing thing to a lot of people to think, wow, what a powerful country we were. Maybe we can be like that again. And they use this historical imagery. And then they suggest that the suppression was caused by A, B, and C, and it was all a big conspiracy, right? And this is all fitting the same framework, right? And I mean, this is also a warning to the US, because if the US in the future, if it is a multipolar world, which actually I think is a fair point, these psycho dictators keep emphasizing it, but they actually do a point here that we are moving into a multipolar world. Then the US is going to struggle, and people will start to appeal back to a time in which the US had supreme dominance. Because I think the US is going to become, I mean, it's a very young country still, but it's going to become one of these countries. So I think China certainly fits in with that, and it's kind of understandable because it did have such dominance globally historically. And again, it's about how it's used. It's about whether it's used as a perception of a threat. Look, we've been threatened in the past. That's how we lost our power. And then it really does fit in with this fascistic tendency. And I certainly think under Xi's rule, it's become very ambiguous and moving towards being able to say that. So, I mean, I give not you room, but this definition of fascism. I certainly think there's plausibility to it. I just don't want to jump the gun, because if that then happens later on, people will say, well, you've been saying this all along. And I think the same things happen in the US. The fascism has been used as a term for so long, and was used for Trump version 1.0, that now when we say it, people are saying, oh, you've been saying this the whole time. And I think there's some credence to that it's not always good to prematurely state these things, even when there's a potential for it. And you have to be clear that you're talking about potential, not that it's actually.
Well, I mean, In a previous conversation, I said this before. I don't like using the N words in these conversations much because they're like everything. The Nazis were dialed everything to 11, and they can create a very distorted view of things. But to bring in the N words into this, if in 1935 there was something happened within in the party hierarchy that led to mass dissent and led to the equivalent of a color revolution in 1935 and overthrew the Nazi regime and reinstated something akin to the Weimar Republic. Would that make the Nazis any less horrible than they were? I mean, yes, the effects were like the amount of damage that they were able to inflict, yes, wouldn't have been as much, but
Well,
would that make
that's a
the
straw man of my
ideology
point. Yeah, but we agree on this,
well,
right? It doesn't.
yeah.
The ideology was just as fascistic. It had the same potential in theory that just wasn't achieved. But we're not talking about the destructiveness as a measure of it, right?
No. I'm not using that as a point. The point I'm trying to make with this is that I'm very hesitant to tie the outcomes to the labeling of an ideology as fascist, because I think labeling something as fascist is all about how it is practiced and how it is and what the intents are behind it.
Sure. But what I'm saying is not it's not the outcomes, but it comes to a point where by deduction it can be no other reason as to why you're doing something or behaving in a certain way. Right? There's just no ambiguity as to what the intent is. So in the case of China, for example, in terms of its expansionist aspect, and like you said, it doesn't have to achieve all these points, but that would be one point, and a big point in my opinion, would be when it's starting to overexert itself. Let's say that the other powers in the world are really weak. Maybe there's some kind of global conflict between Russia, Europe, and the US gets involved, and China's still there. If China's still trying to gain dominance, and maybe it's being opportunist in doing so, but if it really is continues down this path, it will become undeniable. And it doesn't mean to say that it's been necessarily so devastating, although obviously those two things often fall in line, that it becomes clearer because of the devastation being caused. Because let's be frank, we're talking about a very destructive force eventually. Fascism will always become a destructive force if left to fester for long enough. But it's not the destruction itself, it's just that point in which the ambiguity is no longer there.
Well, I mean, and that's where I think we'll differ on it, because I don't think their intents are ambiguous. Because I will take them at their word for what their intent is.
But they've contradicted their word. I mean, she has discussed and condemned ethno-fascism. Apparently, I mean, forgive my Mandarin for not being.
Well, and that's why I'm curious on what I am now curious on. I guess more of the context of that, because because what you can argue that there's their project now of handification is a form of ethno-fascism, not in the genetic sense, but in as far as trying to label everything that practices their culture as the ethnic Han Chinese. I mean, you can go back to artifacts in Western China that were discovered recently, discovered in the past 10 years, that they're just very different culturally from what you'd expect from like the Warring States period, from artifacts that you get from that era. And the government mandate was, no, these were all Chinese. And what this shows is that the universal Chinese culture was much more diverse than we originally thought. And it's like, no, these were different people. Then it's like they're very explicit in their intent for a uniform monolith national identity, national culture. And that's what I'm curious on the background of what he was saying, because if he's trying to warn against like ethnically, genetically people from the Yellow River Valley region being discriminatory against everybody who does not have that same genealogy, then yes, that is something that he needs to be very wary of. But it's also something that his Han supremacist movement fosters and encourages, regardless of what he says about it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a fair point that being ethno-fascist doesn't mean to say that you're looking at the gene pool, right? An ethnicity isn't a priori the genetic. It's a matter of interpretation, but generally speaking, if you look at other ethnicities around the world, like the Hungarians, who seem to love their ethnicity, but most of them aren't related to the original Hungarians from Central Asia, right? Which is where their language originates from. So their language has a different origin from their genetic. So if they want to pick to have both of those, then they're going to contradict themselves because they're effectively people of the Balkans or of Central Europe genetically, but their culture ties back and has a lot of origins with its with Central Asia, hence the name in English we have the Huns and Hungarians, right? And same thing with the Bulgarians. Genetically, the Bulgarians are Slavic peoples, but the original Bulgarians were not. What I understand, it's not a Slavic origin. So there's often
they want their Magyar heritage, damn it.
Yeah, well, exactly. But people hate to hear this, right? I mean, the same thing in Britain. There's all these British people saying, "Oh, this is a Christian country, and we're speaking English," and they're, British nationalists. I think if you're British nationalists, you should be promoting Gaelic languages, and you should be really hating English because that's the language of the Germanic invaders, right? So if you're really about British culture, then you should be a bit upset about what happened when the Angles and Saxons came over.
Or Christianity too. That's a Latin scourge.
I know, exactly. So you complain about the Middle Eastern religions in the UK, then you're going to have to go back to your paganism, right? So, I mean, it's a great way, I think, actually, to show the contradictions in a lot of this kind of ethno-fascism, because they do try and tie genetics in with their culture. But it doesn't seem at this point that they're doing this in China. On the other hand, it doesn't mean to say it's not ethno-fascism as well, right? And so again, I'm not saying that it isn't this. I'm just saying it's somewhat ambiguous, because you can try and steelman that argument as, oh, well, it's about stability of a culture and of a country, and it's a threat if you have too much diversity, and Islam is a threat to the communist state, and therefore it's not because of their ethnicity. It's just because it's not compatible, right? And that's of course is the public messaging around it. But then the vindictiveness in which they're applying these laws, and I mean the sterilization of men going on among the Uyghurs. This sounds a little more than just pragmatically getting rid of threats. This seems vindictive and vicious, which then feeds into that ethno-nationalism, right?
Exactly, yeah. And there's also the timetables, like their national unification project, I think is by 2047, I think is the goal. No, 2049, which is the centennial anniversary for the victory in the Civil War. There's a self-imposed deadline for national unification, like unification with Taiwan, full suppression of their western provinces. But I mean, going to this contradictoriness, I mean, and that's kind of inherent to fascism. I mean, I want to read it. I've been reading the words of many of other people quite a bit in this conversation, but I'll do it again. I'll going back to Umberto Eco. And he even uses the word fuzzy, which is a word you used earlier. So I think you'll like this. Nevertheless, historical priority does not seem to me a sufficient reason to explain why the word fascism became a psychondoche. I don't actually know what that word. I don't know how to pronounce that. That is a word that could be used for a different totalitarian movements. This is not because fascism contained in itself, so to speak, in their quintessential state, all the elements of any latter form of totalitarianism. On the contrary, fascism has no quintessence. Fascism was a fuzzy totalitarianism, a college of different philosophical and political ideas, a beehive of contradictions. One can conceive of a truly totalitarian movement that was able to combine monarchy with revolution, the royal army with Mussolini's personal missa, the grant and privileges to the church with the state, education extolling violence, absolute state control with a free market. The fascist party was born boasting that it brought a revolutionary new order, but it was financed by the most conservative among the landowners who expected from it a counter-revolution. At the At its beginning, fascism was Republican, yet it survived for 20 years proclaiming its loyalty to the royal family, while the Deuce, the Unchallenged's maximal leader, was arm in arm with the king, whom he offered the title of emperor. I think that I think that paragraph is a great encapsulation of what you're saying, and the point I'm trying to make with this as well is that it is, and it's something that you even mentioned earlier in this conversation about some of these points being very contradictory. Fascism is a very contradictory ideology.
Yeah, that's why, to be frank, most fascists are pretty much snowflakes, right? They don't they don't like to delve too much into their own ideals, because then they start to be confronted with their contradictions. And just starting from ethno-fascism, and which I think is at the kernel of most fascistic states, you have some notion of ethnicity, right, to as a kernel. And then you have, okay, well, there's the genetic history and the movement of the peoples, which is often part of the mythos, right? And then you have the history of the culture and the language. And if you look, they don't often line up, and that's quite painful for a lot of people. For a lot of
we'll go to I'll use two modern day examples. One, we can go with the Chinese, and we can move to the wonderful United States. But with China, you have a party that is trying to claim a Marxist-Leninist ideology that is basing itself off of a ethnic national project. Taking to granted what we've talked about, the ambiguity of the word ethnic for this description, that uses free markets with party control and leadership, hybridized free markets with party control and a corporatist economic project. And these are all very a lot of these things are very contradictory with each other, but they work in the same system.
Actually, to push back on that, do you not think that, frankly, fascism is evolving to avoid these contradictions, avoid these criticisms, right? So if you can see some aspects of capitalism in China, people say, oh, well, it's not this original form of communism, and so it's a state moving in a positive direction, which then people start to forgo the critique in terms of whether it's actually a good state or not. And so people start to accept it a little more. And the same thing with ethno-fascism, going back to the US, there has been this evolution of the current form of fascism that they're clearly moving away from the genetic description, unless you're Nick Fuentes, right? Or we pronounce his name. A lot of the notions of fascism is, oh no, it's just about culture. We don't care really where, even if they do or don't, at least they pay lip service to the notion, we don't care where your forefathers originated from. We just care about your culture, right? So there's a recognition of these contradictions, and there's an evolution to try and overcome them, or to try and take on traits that are not considered fascistic, so as to mask what's really going on. You could argue that that's happening, right?
Well, yeah, but to go further, what I guess we mean by these contradictions, right, is that they seem contradictory to you and I, but to them it works because their viewpoint is coming from a different place. Like if you look at Xi Jinping, this world that he's created is not contradictory to him because it's coming from the worldview that he intends. He wants the Han Chinese people to rise to its ascendancy that he thinks it deserves, and this is the architecture that seems to be getting there. But I guess with you're looking with free markets, the crackdown that Xi has done.
Yeah, exactly.
On the free markets. Yeah. Exactly. That started in 2017. This was a crackdown on what he viewed as internal contradictions to their project, which from an external point of view, we can view as him, the way that he did it was contradictory to his national project. But it's because if I'm looking at China and thinking, okay, they want to have their global ascendancy. They want to be the biggest player on the world stage. They want to be a world leader in all the technological sectors. Why the hell are you putting these party leaderships in these companies and kneecapping them and doing these things? But that's because of my worldview and my rationale creates a kind of logic train that leads to these decisions seems to be not a great idea. But if you're coming from Z's point of view, which is the supreme goal, that his supreme goal is the survival of the party rule in China above everything else, because he believes, and this is not and ambiguation. This is something that he has stated many times. But he believes that the only way that China will succeed in its goals is through the single party rule. And so if you look at what these companies were doing, like Jack Ma, like they were amassing a lot of power and influence under themselves, which created a threat to the state. So yeah, from his point of view, the logical train is, okay, we do have to increase party control over these private enterprises and kind of knock them down a few pegs.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, that's clearly at the very least authoritarian. Whether it's this subset of authoritarianism that fits into fascism is another question, but it does still point in that direction. That this insecurity and this dominance that you need centralization of power is not compatible with having a dynamic market in which you have competitions to your power. They don't even have to be on the same scale, but they still have to lead you to a level of compromise, right? Which is what the Jack Ma was becoming. Still is. We don't know. I mean, have we heard about him in recent times?
Yeah, no, he's back on the world stage. He was,
okay.
But the thing, but
so he's not falling out windows
because
like in Russia.
Because what Xi's trying to do is he's not trying to create a complete command economy. It's just he doesn't. The Chinese project, and this is why like it's important to kind of the Chinese project right now is not to create a like 1950s Soviet dreamscape of what the Soviets were trying to do, of a completely top-down controlled command economy. That's not their goal. Their goal is for the private market and private enterprise to be subservient and directed by the state, which is a fundamentally different thing. And so what Jack Ma was doing when he on his rise to greatness before he got knocked down several pegs was he was amassing unto himself something similar to what Elon Musk was trying to amass. And it's something that I can understand, honestly. I wish in the United States we kind of recognize that some of these people have become a national security liability.
Well, next week we can do whether the US is fascist. I think that would also be an interesting discussion as well, right? I mean,
you can say there's nothing. The United States is different. I wouldn't say the United States is fascist. I say that there's a fascist movement trying to solidify their control.
Yeah.
Like because, but it's the, but I mean, going to what China was doing, the control of markets is not in the sense of complete command and control. It's having it be aligned and working with the intent of the party and not being a threat to it.
Okay, but to push back on that, I mean, you can say that. I mean, from that, I'm trying to steelman this argument. I don't entirely agree with it.
Yeah.
But that they could be saying, okay, we need to constrain the market for national interest. It's not about that. The party's interest is the national interest. Therefore, we don't want these players to become too large and then to compromise the stability and the health of the China as a country, right? And in that sense, there's always that aspect of constraining markets because they can start to be damaging to a nation if you don't legislate it properly. Right? Like, for example, in the UK, we had payday loans, so there was effective interest rates of thousands of percent, and loans being given out, and this was damaging the fabric of the British society. And so then the British government of the time put forward a lot of heavy legislation to basically make these types of loans illegal. Of course, it was good for the party that was in power at the time, and it was good for the UK. I think it was under the Tory party as well that this happened. But that's clearly, constraining the market because it was good for the country, but it was also good for the party at the same time.
But you can understand the difference in mechanisms there. I mean, you just explained it. Like you said it was the legislator passed legislation, right, that put constraints on the market.
Mm-hmm.
What's happened with China what's happened in China is not only has there been legislation and crackdowns and arrests, but it's been increased party control and influence in not just like the direction, but the inner workings and day-to-day running of these companies. So you have party members of the board.
But this goes back to the US, right? I mean, and the purchasing of IBM or the use of executive orders.
There's a fascist movement in the United States that's trying to consolidate power. So if you want to use the US in saying fascistic things that we're doing right now, I'm not going to disagree with you. There are fascists trying to take control. They're going to be doing fascist things.
Yeah, exactly. But these criticisms, then there is an aspect, if we're being fair here, of saying, well, okay, we're starting to see very similar things in the US.
Oh yes,
Um,
that's part of the reasons why I've been, I guess, been so bullish on this point lately, is because I think you can learn a lot of lessons from seeing what China is doing right now to help
mhm.
you better understand what's happening in the United States. Because fundamentally, they're not the exact same thing, but there's a lot of mechanisms at play that are the same.
Yeah, and just go over a point we made earlier, or I made earlier, was this notion of the Wittgensteinian view of language, that the meanings of words are not given by direct description as in the Augustinian model, but it's kind of a collection of associations, and it doesn't have to be all those associations. And it's one of the reasons I really like this description of fascism that you brought up. Well, I don't like fascism, but the description, because it doesn't have to tick all the boxes. It's a very much a Wittgensteinian meaning of the term fascist, and I think that's a far more effective way to discuss whether something is or isn't fascist or predicated. You can predicate a country or any ideal in general in language, rather than saying, oh, it has to be strictly this definition per se. Okay, that's one example of how it could fit in with that meaning. But there's two reasons why this conversation is interesting. One is to learn about fascism and what it is, and so therefore seeing if its comeuppance is occurring in the US or the UK in the future, for example. But the other thing is also, and I want to segue onto this now because there's another point I think is really interesting, is assuming that China is in some way a fascistic state, even if it's got tendencies, what should the West be doing? Are Western nations making mistakes in their relations with China? Should they cut themselves off entirely? Should they make trade agreements contingent on any changes in the Chinese government? How can we be fair to China, or how can we be good to ourselves? Is that even the same thing, or is there some contradiction in regards to that?
I mean, well, that's the big question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to say what we should do. It's particularly what we can do at this point, mainly because the biggest bulwark against their Chinese expansionism um, has been shot to shit in the past. Fuck, it's almost a year now. God damn it. Um, the like what it's really it becomes a form of deterrence, and I don't want to. And as much as as much as all the bad connotations and the bad things that came out of containment during the Cold War, you can see how containment wasn't just applied to communism. I mean, think of Franconism in Spain. That was a fascist state. They were not invaded during the Second World War, and they weren't invaded after the fact, but there were limitations on it. People, they were kind of hedged in on things. They weren't really given room to. I don't know if Franco had any intent on retaking the American colonies in Central and South America, but if he did, he definitely was never in a position to do anything about it.
I'm sure he dreamt about it, though, right?
I'm sure he dreamt about it, yes, but he wasn't in a position to do about it. But it didn't need to end in a war. I mean, you look at what would have happened if Germany went a different road. I don't Mussolini, I don't believe, starts major wars with major powers. I think Italian regime probably would have gone the way Spain went, which is 40 years of dicking around with fascism before it collapsing in on itself and getting some kind of liberal society popping out of that. China, it's anyone's best guess what China's going to be 40 years from now, but I don't think that there should be intervention into China. I think that would be one of the stupidest things they could do.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of some kind of form of containment was what was the strategy the Biden administration was going before, and was the strategy that the U.S.'s long-standing strategy with China, how to deal with China, to various degrees of effectiveness. But the idea of creating strong multilateral alliances with nations around China and creating a network that makes it difficult, if not impossible, for them to expand aggressively would have been the best goal. We don't live in that world anymore, thanks to certain people in the United States. That it's very ambiguous where things can go into that, but it's at this point that's what makes it hard, is that to answer that question, we'd have to have a good idea, a stable idea of what different governments around the world are going to be doing. But because of the schizophrenia that's happening within the United States, it's a very hard thing to predict.
Yeah, and
where
it's also hard
yeah.
for Europe to act alone, and if the US isn't a reliable partner, to some extent, the EU or Europe more broadly needs allegiances elsewhere, and it can't entirely isolate itself from China and the US. I think that's going to become very, very tricky. And then does it go towards countries like Brazil, which, I mean, in the future it could also end up being somewhat of an authoritarian regime, right? That could happen. So any country that you have an allegiance with, it's not just about where you're at now, but where you predict it will be in the future. Like you say,
And
fascism can fizzle
yeah.
out quite easily, and there is a level of hope within China in that regards. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge as countries our own weaknesses. I think that and forgive me for saying, but the US sometimes has lacked a bit of humility in terms of acknowledging its own weaknesses. And it's a democracy, but it doesn't mean to say it's a great democracy all the time. And I mean, I could look back at, we could do a scorecard for the wars in the past, right? And then say which war was just. And I think some of them would be, at the very least, ambiguous. And that goes back
Well,
to
I mean,
the
you
Vietnam
can
War,
go
for
to
example,
the
right? It was not
early,
really.
well, I mean, even worse than the Vietnam War. Look at the early 1900s war in the Philippines. That's
Mhm.
at the fallout of the Spanish-American War. That I think does that. Well, it's not. I think it does not get enough attention in American education systems. The Spanish-American War and the fallouts of that. It was horrific what was done in the Philippines by U.S. forces during its occupation and
Yes.
with our
Just before I forget my point here, but my point
yeah.
being is that acknowledging some of these, frankly, mistakes in the past, or levels of aggression that were not constructive at the very least, you can then approach dialogue with other countries in terms of criticizing them, frankly, with a greater sense of humility that actually allows you to be listened to a little bit more, rather than saying, "Hey, we're the perfect nation. How come you're not as good as us?" And forgetting
Mhm.
all the questionable points. And I think maybe this is ironically arrogance on my part as a European, but European nations seem to approach it a little better. I mean, Germany, of course, was forced into admitting how messed up its past was, but that has made for a better country today. And also on the international stage, the way in which it approaches this discussion and dialogue is from a greater level of humility. So it's not to say that China's not far more authoritarian and consistently so for many decades. That it's a country, frankly, that I wouldn't want to live in because of the lack of freedoms of its peoples, and the trajectory it's even going in with that regards is of course worsening. So it's not to say which one's worse. It's just to recognize some traits, and at the same time, you can find good things to say about China. It's not quite North Korea, right?
Mhm.
And some of the aspects of investment that's gone on, or even environmental regulation. From what I understand, and this may show my ignorance in the matter, but the national government does try and push for forward regulation. The problem is there's so much corruption in local government in China that it can be quite difficult to implement. So you could try and find these things that exist to recognize it's for the constructive criticism on the international stage. But ultimately, I think we both agree we can't push for a real change in the political system. So we're going to have to we will have to deal with them, right? As whether it's Europeans or Americans.
Yeah, and going to what you're talking about with the humility is that there was a attempt in the United States to do that. Um, but it's like it was called it got hijacked by many things. And now we seem to pivoted far away from that. But I do agree. And I will have to push back a little bit with Europe. I'd say that humility is very case by case.
Oh, but I'm
Um,
taking an average here, right? I'm not talking about the
yeah,
UK. I mean, a bit better, than the US, but it doesn't say too much, right?
yeah.
The-
It's yeah. I mean, you were talking earlier about the UK. It's I have to say it's very case by case, but it's hard because it's in the end. You've heard of the Christian concept of original sin, right?
yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah, I don't know it in detail. Forgive my lack of.
Just the gist of it is that the idea is that because of the sins of some people in the past, I forget which biblical figures caused it. It might have been,
Well, Adam and
I don't
Eve and
remember.
eating the apple and all that stuff. I mean, that was
I think
considered a
so,
sin,
yeah.
right?
But
So,
because of that, it's like you're born with sin
Mm-hmm.
because of past actions. I have always balked at that form of thinking with anything. And I don't believe a people should be held account for the actions that their predecessors have done. So that's like
For
modern day
sure,
Germans,
yeah.
I don't think should be held account for what the Nazis did.
No, no, but let me just push back on that, because that's often a talking point of. No, that's a talking point of the
no,
far
no, hold
right.
on. Let me finish my train of thought on that.
Yeah,
It's but that does not mean the counteract the talking point the far right. That doesn't mean that what happened didn't happen, and the effects of what happened don't still persist into today. And that doesn't mean that those don't need to be dealt with. Like, I am not responsible for, in the United States, the slavery that happened here.
yeah, exactly,
But I
exactly.
live in a world where the effects and repercussions of that enslavement still persist, and we need to deal with that. And it's just that's where I think it's hard for a lot of people, because I think people sometimes associate guilt with responsibility.
Mm.
Um, and so if you're looking for going to the United States with the ethnic minorities here, is particularly the African American ethnic minorities here, um, there is a responsibility to them, even though I might not be guilty of that. There's a responsibility to deal with the current inequality and the current repercussions of that system that have never fully been addressed.
Yeah.
And that's just a very difficult thing to grapple with, because what I feel like what happens is that people fall into the trap. It's a very easy trap of that kind of that mentality of original sin for these things, that the responsibility therefore equates guilt.
Yeah, for sure, and of course in the or in the German context, the healthy application of that is no one really feels guilty about it. It's a matter of just learning from the past mistakes. It's not even about whether
Yeah.
there's repercussions today. Even if there wasn't repercussions, we can still learn this about human nature and about seeing the trajectory and the path to fascism, the path towards a horribly destructive and vicious regime, right? It's about recognizing that path, and that path can be trodden by any nation, any peoples. So even if there wasn't repercussions, even if there was a perfect equality between all groups of people in the US, it still wouldn't negate the fact that it's important to learn from those parts of history. And like you're saying, it's not that we should feel guilt in the name of our forefathers, but on that same note, therefore, we shouldn't feel too much pride either, right? Pride should
Oh,
be about what
100%.
we
Yeah.
achieve, and so there's also
Exactly. Yeah.
that problem that can come up, and it's often in the far right, or like being proud of what our forefathers did. No, we haven't done that. It's about what we do today and the investment we put into a nation as individuals and into our communities. That we should feel pride in. I mean, it goes back to Aquinas's idea that pride is a sin. I don't entirely agree with that, but I think pride in what someone else has done, or in what a football team has done, but you didn't do anything really to support them, for example, I think it's a bit nonsensical. That's soccer, by the way, you'd say in America.
Yeah.
Not the other football.
I'm not that much of a Philistine. I know what you mean.
So I mean, these are really interesting points. But what I'm stating with in the European humility context is not saying, oh, we feel terrible about our past. It's just saying we can see how our countries have done these things in the past. It wasn't even that long ago. So we're not expecting perfection from you, right? Starting from that point, it's far easier to be constructively critical than stating, we don't understand how you could be so bad. Like, we demand that you change within the next 2 months. It's just going to be ineffective and actually push nations away. But this goes back to like a practical examples of what the hell, for example, Europe should do, right? Let's assume in the future that the US gets a democratic leadership, and then they show some humility and say, well, we went through a really rough patch there, we understand, but could you go towards a little bit more freedoms in this regard? Probably won't necessarily happen, but at least push for that, or recognize the plight of some of the ethnic minorities in China. Assuming that happens, that would be good, and I think the US can do that. But in the here and now for Europe, we're having a little bit of an issue, because Europe sold lots of critical, either is dependent on the supply of semiconductors from China, to the point at which it doesn't even have really any of its own fabs for semiconductor fabrication here in Europe. And there's one of these major ports in Greece owned by China, Europe's been like, okay, well, we realize this is perhaps compromising our security. And then China's turned around and goes, well, it's said it to the US, but I'm sure Europe is thinking about buying this port back, and China saying, no, we don't want to sell it. I mean, firstly, there's no obligation, right, on the part of China to sell their strategic resources and strategic infrastructure in Europe. And secondly, I mean, what can Europe then do to become a little bit more independent of China?
Yeah, I mean that's part of the fun thing about living in the prelude to global discontent, right? Is who the fuck knows where we're going? Uh, there's so many
I
things
love
that
that
are,
description. It's a great description.
but it's what makes that question extra hard is just like if you told me 2 years ago where I thought China was going, um, it seemed very apparent that they were barreling, and I still think they are. It's just I'm right now. It's just what's happening in the United States is just so mind-fuckingly stupid. It's just kind of overshadows everything. Um, but like China's going through a major demographic collapse. Um, their workforce is on track to decrease by quite a bit over the next 20 years. Um, and they're doing very similar things to Japan and Korea in the sense of not preparing for it, as a lot of nations are.
Hmm.
Um, and I would have said that, well, the best thing to do is try to just, hold out, not create bad deals, but create swallowable deals and try to maintain relations good enough so that you're not it's that balance, right, of trying to maintain relations that are not malfeasant towards you but also not provocative towards them. It's a hard balance to maintain, but it's doable. Currently right now though, it's just everything seems to be just in flux.
Yeah,
And that's what makes it hard to try to think about where things are going, because like in the industry that I'm in the space industry,
mm,
it's hard for me to try to think of where the space industry is going to be in 15 years or 5 years or 3 years, because so much of that, because it's on the in the pyramid of industrial civilization. At the very top of the pyramid, you have things like the space industry, chip manufacturing, that kind of stuff. These very end the line, like high precision manufacturing, very, very complex systems that are hyper dependent on everything below them. And if everything's in constant flux, it makes it very hard to predict where things are going to be. Um, and what's more complicated than either of those two industries? The entire global global economy and how nations interrelate with each other. So it's hard to say when you don't know if the United States is going to flip fascist authoritarian or a hybridization or fade into a thing in the next 2 years.
mm.
It's hard to predict where things are going to go. It's hard to predict with Europe because, I mean, with Europe, right, you guys are having a massive surgence of right-wing ideologies.
I'm glad you recognize that, because I mean, from an American perspective, it may be easy to kind of, I don't know, look at the EU itself, or look at specific nations in Europe, or look at the UK with its Labour government. But we've never had such a strong polling for a far right party in the UK as we do now, and it's consistent. And I think there is a sizable minority, but so long as not everyone votes in the country, you don't need a majority to get power, right? And
Exactly, yeah.
also, we don't have proportional representation in the UK, just like in the US. So it's then prone to how the votes are distributed, and you can be strategic about this as a party if you're clever and actually get power this way. And I think Reform UK, this far right party, I mean, they're not stupid, sadly. They may play that game. So there is a real threat, and in the end, it doesn't really. It sounds pretty awful to say. I mean, so long as you don't look at the extremer cases, but if a very nasty party gets into power and doesn't implement full fascism to the point of getting rid of entirely of democracy, because that's what it would require. Even however awful that might be, if it's just for one term, most of our democracies can survive that. Okay, I mean, let's ignore Trump version 1.0, but version 2.0 is really bordering on that. If the Democrats can win the midterms to stifle their destructiveness, and then win in the next election, America will survive and it will be okay. But in Europe, I mean, I can see the groundwork being laid for continued resurgence of this far right ideals, and I think it was Bill Clinton, right? It's the economy, stupid, he said. Right? It's really hugely relevant today, because there was a really interesting MIT paper on the scarcity of resources that it wrote in the 70s, and a few years ago it wrote a kind of a sequel to this paper to say, hey, we're basically going down plan A-2, like this variant of the paths in which we could go, where we don't take care of our resources. And the consequences is massive inflation and effectively destruction of our economies. And we're just blindly dancing down that path. If you think about our consumables, it's all good having lots of luxuries and our materialistic lifestyles. That isn't necessarily a problem, but it is when it's with all this built-in obsolescence, and we just have loads of plastic packaging around things that we don't really need it around, and all the consequences of this. Or like mobile phones where we can't upgrade them and we have to keep buying, a whole new case for the phone and then make our version of Android obsolete and stuff. This is really problematic, because we are just draining through some of these resources. And even if we don't run out of them, the scarcity will increase the cost of production. And of course, it's got an inflationary pressure. So it's really well studied by MIT. And that could really screw up our economies, alongside climate change, putting pressures on food production.
Oh, yeah.
I was reading about this the other day. There's too much emphasis on cereals and staples and the stability of those in the next few years, compared to some of they're not luxuries, but foods that give us vitamins and protein sources. They're actually more sensitive to the climate change. And we're already seeing that. So in Europe, for example, olive production for a few years was really hard hit. And olive oil price, for example, doubled. Not to say that that's in isolation a problem, but if you look across the board, you can already start to see the inflationary pressure from climate change on food production, let alone where we're going. So with all these things in mind, we've got to consider what kind of regimes may pop out the other end when countries in almost perpetual economic turmoil. And that really worries me in Europe. I mean, maybe the US will learn from Trump, and even we're going through a period, where you have some reasonable government. That's the hope.
We'll see what happens. But I mean, like, I think you're pointing out something really, really, really key here. And I was touching on a little bit, like, if you told me before 2 years ago where I think China was going into area of increased instability, I think that's just, you can say that across the board everywhere for a lot of different reasons, whether it be climate change, whether it be a lot of pretty much at this point financial fraud at the international scale, just kind of catching up with everybody. We're going to a rough time regardless, and that's what worries me with the United States more than anything, because I'm not deluded to think things will get better if Trump's get kicked out and the Democrats coming back into power, because it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's just going to get worse regardless before anything could possibly get better. What I'm fighting for is for the possibility of trying to build off ramps so that things can eventually get better, versus just continuing to spiral down into something even worse that we don't need to speculate around. And I'm worried about how that is going to affect things, because I could very easily see a Democratic victory happening, and then just like with under Biden, how under the Biden administration things were systemically becoming better. They were fixing. There's some systemic issues that were becoming better, but the change was not immediate.
Well, that's not his fault, right? Yeah, I mean,
exactly. But what matters is that sometimes trends take years or decades to work themselves out. So if you have something like COVID, where the entire international economy went kaput, that is a many year process of fully recovering from.
If you look at long COVID rates, for example, and the effects on productivity that can have, I mean, our economies are still to this day being damaged by COVID waves. It's just that we got used to the threat, right, on the individual level.
Yeah, but the alleviation was not immediate, and people lost their minds over it. And that's what worries me, especially with all the damage Trump has done so far. And let's say that in 3-ish years, they get the best case scenario, they get fully excised. They don't try any coup attempts, or if they did, they failed spectacularly. um, the damage from that is going to take decades to repair. And what I have a feeling is that there's going to be an expectation that they'll be fixed in a matter of years or less. And when that reality does not manifest itself, I worry about a resurgence in the things that got us here in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, there's a
Um,
paradox, right? If it's not bad enough for people to learn from, then it may come back again. So if you really don't have your democracy seriously threatened, then you're going to end up having it potentially come back again. But this goes back to a point which I insinuated before in terms of resource scarcity. That do you not think, for example, environmental measures on sustainability should be kind of recast as um, maintaining sovereignty in our nations and stability of our economies rather than it just being the environmental aspect? Because a lot of our wastefulness with resources also makes us dependent on continued mining of those resources, the gaining of those resources from countries around the world. And so a lot of sustainability measures could actually be good for our countries to lead a more independent trajectory, right?
well, I'm actually very open at this point to how to fuck the sell climate change to people, because everything that's tried to work, everything that's been tried so far has not worked. Even the fucking military here in the United States trying to make their pitch of strategic climate change being a strategic threat to U.S. military forces. That went on to deaf ears. So at this point, I'm willing to try anything. Well, okay, not anything. I'm willing to try a lot at this point to try to sell climate change to people,
Mm-hmm.
including maybe taking a protectionist, nationalistic route and to an extent. Um,
I mean,
I'm
that's a bit
very
extreme.
wary of that.
I don't mean, I mean, it doesn't have to go to that extreme, a protectionist nationalist route. It's simply that it creates an increased level of stability. Of course, it's good for the environment, but I do feel like policies on the left aren't argued enough from an economic standpoint anyway. But it's
Well,
not just
I
about the
try to do
size of
that
the economy,
with.
but the stability of the economy too that should be argued for,
I
right?
mean, I am hesitant too, because I mean I've tried this argument with NATO with people. Like NATO is an incredibly stabilized. It is an incredibly good force economically because it creates a lot of stability, and stability is good for international relations and trade and just economies in general. Um, NATO has been one of the greatest economic boons to the world over the past 80 years. It's a very stabilizing force, and so with the stability route, I will, like I said, I will continue to try doing anything I can at this point with climate change to get people more aware of it. It's just one of the things I've been running into a lot is just a little bit of disillusionment with people's rationality, ability to think through problems,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of what argument I present to them. But I agree with you 100%. Yes, I think regardless of your economic system, whether you're an authoritarian democrat or a fascist or a democracy or a um, anarcho-capitalist commune, it's climate change is bad for you.
Yeah,
Um,
but what I'm saying also is if let's say the US and Europe got themselves into a war and overnight the taps were turned off from rare earth minerals from China, right? We have some from Ukraine still, if Ukraine was one of our allies. But how quickly can we turn around or at least reuse what we have if the infrastructure is not in place to recycle and reuse, for
well, I
example,
mean,
electronic components and this and such like. So, or we just don't have quite the level of built-in obsolescence, so the products last a little bit
I mean,
longer.
there's two ways to answer that. One is what I'd like to see happen. One is what would probably happen. The thing with rare earths is rare earth minerals, rare earth metals. They're not actually that rare.
Hmm.
They're everywhere. Every nation actually has quite a lot of reserves of them. It's just the extraction or refinement processes are very ecologically destructive and very expensive to set up.
Hmm.
Um, So, well, to answer your question, what I think would probably happen is that we just do more ecological destruction to get them. What I'd hope would happen is that we'd be smarter about it and do more recycling. But what would happen in reality if the US got into a war and our rare earth metals were cut off is that we'd go into scarcity and immediately start strip mining and throw out any environmental protections and start trying to get these things up and running as fast as possible.
Yeah, for sure. But this is kind of my point that whichever method we choose, and probably we wouldn't choose that if it was in our own backyard, and hopefully NIMBYism would help us in this regard. is if we had already implemented some level of recycling of these materials, or the reuse of products in like in a second life type of way. Like we have, for example, electric car batteries being used as stationary battery storage, a really good
Mhm.
form of recycling rather than just breaking it all down and rebuilding it again. So, I mean, this kind of culture and promoting this type of culture, maybe through subsidy, would also make us more resilient in times where we had to stand on our own 2 feet and not rely upon imports from other nations. So, okay, we could go down the destructive route, but either route would be whether we destroy our own backyard in the meantime so we're prepared for it, or whether we already have a system of reuse and recycling. This is also from a security standpoint critical, right? And maybe that should be argued more often.
Yeah, and I agree with you, right? But I mean, what you're talking about right now is long-term return on investment way of thinking. I remember that article you wrote.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you read it.
But
Okay.
yeah, but that's the problem is that
Mm,
you and I might agree on we need a better approach to thinking of return on investment for things, but
yeah.
that doesn't seem to be the way that things pan out most of the time. I mean, everything right now seems to be very reactionary.
Yeah,
Um,
but there's the policy, and then it's how it's sold, right? I feel like return on investment um, narrative has not been used enough. It's too much about, hey, we don't want to kill the animals and the insects and everything else, which I really, really personally care about, but a lot of people don't. And so when they make it something a bit more tangible, that return on investment, and you look in someone's lifetime or in the next decade and how that can influence and affect somebody, right? Because the return on investment I was arguing for in that article was not over 50 years, it was over 5, 10 years that you start to get a positive return on
mhm.
investment. So, and that's, by the way, Sweden's fiscal policy is really in line with the article I wrote. So you could argue from this perspective, and you hit lots of birds with one stone, right? You hit the decoupling a little bit from China and other nations around the world, and not just China that's has questionable leadership. And then you gain independence, and it's environmentally beneficial. So you can actually package all these things into one package, and then use security, economic stability. It's not just about growth, right? It's about growing an economy that's stable. It's like trying to get bigger by eating loads of McDonald's and getting stupidly fat and then having a heart attack. It's not. It's not just about size. It's about stability. And so economic stability and security could be hammered home in terms of these policies, and they seem to link right with decoupling from China, which I think is probably to some extent a good thing.
I mean, yeah, I agree. It's just I agree with you. It's just what worries me right now is that we're in a world where in order to get power, you need two things: is mass media manipulation, and second, to be as populist as fuck and lie about everything. Um, and I think if we get enough resources together, we could do the first, but the second, but the second is the problem I think we'd run into. I don't know. I'd be on board at this point, getting our own bot farms that start counteracting a lot of this shit. But
Well,
that's a lot of money, and I'm not a state actor, so I don't have the resources for that.
do you not see the difference between like outrightly lying and being a little bit ambiguous in
There
in a
is
misleading
no,
way,
no.
should we
I
say?
100% see the difference. It's
Yeah.
just there's a if you just outright lie and say I will make egg price. Let me use a U.S. example. Egg prices are too high. Yeah, I'm not even going to talk about why they're too high, that there's a bird flu epidemic and we have to cull a lot of the flocks.
Hmm.
I'm just going to say egg prices are too high and we're going to fix them day one. If you just outright lie when people feel like they're financially hurting, regardless of how much they're actually hurting, but if they think they're hurting,
Mm.
that's going to sound much better than, hey, here's a smart program. It's going to be fiscally responsible, yada, yada, yada. Here are the benefits that you will get. And yeah, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but at least there's some reality.
Hmm.
It's hard to fight against outright lies. That's the problem. And especially when you couple that with the disinformation and misinformation bot networks that propagate and push all these things. So people may not even hear your message because they're in their own little bubble.
Well, I'm gonna plug my article for this week in the Pragmatic Papers, because that's it's also about political strategy in this regards, and should be a decoupling a little bit of the what you do politically and the rhetoric around it. So you have to be a bit careful about
I
being
agree.
too aggressive in the rhetoric, actually, at least from the studies I've read on populism. But on the other hand, you should be quite non-cooperative when you experience non-cooperation. And so you should reflect a level of underhanded tactics. Not necessarily in the same way, but you should be untrustworthy as a partner if you've experienced untrustworthiness. Um, uh,
The Do you know much about?
some
Yeah,
of this
sorry.
exaggeration, like if we could dress up, if there's another bird flu pandemic at the end of Trump's reign, we say, oh, what have you done? Maybe some of that could be justified. You have to be pragmatic in that regard.
Yeah, but
So,
I mean, there's a. Do you know much about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, American president in the 40s,
we've discussed them
30s,
before.
40s?
I know. I don't know about as much. I mean, I studied the the Second World War in quite some detail at school, but I've also had these discussions partly with you before. So if you could rehash, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find very interesting about him is not just his own actions, and just to be clear, my biases. I think he was one of the three most impactful presidents in the United States, and one of my favorites personally. But it's fascinating to me is just the mythology about him and how people perceive him. If you look at the lefty populist movement in the United States, he's viewed one way. But I've also talked with people like MAGA who use actions of Roosevelt to justify what Trump's doing, um, with the populism,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just very fascinating to see how people use him, because Roosevelt was in the end, a very pragmatic politician. He was a masterclass in knowing how to move the levers of government and how to move the levers of public opinion to get what he wanted. Um, Luckily for the United States and America, he was ideologically aligned, and was ideologically incentivized to making America a better place. Um, I think he could have been a very damaging person if he had more malevolent intentions. Uh, but he was a what his greatest strength was not from the pulpit, but was the backroom meetings of how to manipulate the levers of power and get people and position people where he wanted, or moving policy in a direction that the public didn't really want to go,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
then capitalizing on it when things happen. So, for example, with like the interlude into the Second World War, United
Mm-hmm.
States entering the Second World War, the embargoes that we put on Japan
Not just
was
that, but
extremely provocative.
the
Yeah.
whole Lend-Lease program, right? Because he was the
Oh,
one.
exactly. Yeah. It's like we people don't remember we sunk German subs in in 1940,
Mm-hmm.
um,
But also
because
the
of
supply
conflict rating.
the supply of weaponry to Britain
Yeah,
was
yeah, and he
invaluable,
was
and we could have really changed the trajectory of the war if he hadn't have done this. Yeah.
yeah, and he was criticized very heavily by his opponents for saying, "Hey, you're saying you don't want to get us into war, but you're doing all these things." And I'm very glad he did what he did, because in the end, it was the best thing for not just the world, but for the United States itself, to do these things, because the force the antagonists in that conflict were very bad, for everybody. um, but it's but you look at like what the actions that he took, it was it was kind of what you're talking about, is that there was a level of manipulation going on, and there was a level of saying one thing. There was a abstraction between policy and rhetoric
Mm-hmm.
and communication with the public. And in that case, I think that's a very good example of seeing someone doing it from a very ethical point of view, an ethical way to do it, that had very good outcomes for the nation that it was being enacted on. Um,
I think you should
but
always
yes,
you
yeah.
should never you should always go to the point in which, in hindsight, you'll be able to argue for why you weren't being dishonest. So
Mhm.
you can, it's sometimes about what you don't say, and what you're focusing on may be a little bit different from what, in terms of your actions, you're actually focusing on, right? And so I think
Yeah, I mean, when you
that's the
look
way
at
you decouple. Is you And I think Roosevelt, I mean, I trust, in your opinion, that he was likely doing something along these lines, as opposed to saying A and then doing B. He was talking about C that didn't relate to either A or B, and it was sometimes a distraction from the effectively what he was actually doing politically.
yeah, I mean, you look at what the the rationale for the oil embargo on Japan, which was you need to get out of China. And it became a hard line for Roosevelt of no, not stopping cessations. You need to, not just scaling things down. Is like you need to full stop. The aggression needs to stop right now. And was people argued at the time like they'll never accept this, and this is just gonna. And you cut off their oil supply, that destroys their entire war machine, and they will react. There will be a reaction from this, and it's. But that wasn't what was communicated with the public. It was, it was a very, when you look at it from the hindsight, it was like this was the ethical thing to do. It's like what they were doing in China. I mean, it's not a lie. It was fucking horrible what the Japanese were doing in China. It's like the U.S. should have reacted. But if you're from an isolationist who's like, well, yeah, I think we should react, but I don't think we should react so hard as to provoke them into attacking us. But yeah, I guess that's probably a good example of what you're talking about, being able to rationalize it from hindsight.
I know it's
maybe something manipulative that you're doing.
You should never be in a position where you have clearly lied. It's simply because your words become untrusted thereafter, and you can't really form cooperation with another party or with the electorate. And so cooperation is always the ultimate goal of any game theory, and cooperation is contingent on trust. So people need to be able to trust in what you're saying. So you can't lie. It's just not effective. But you can be a little bit mischievous in what you focus on. And then that's for other people to try and delineate what you're focusing on and from what you're doing. But
you can tell truth with practical characteristics.
Yeah, but you can talk about the truths you want to talk about and act upon the truths you want to act upon, and they aren't necessarily the two same things. So this is what I'm inferring here, as opposed to you clearly lied, because the Labour government right now in the UK may be put into a corner where their election promises they're going to have to do the opposite of, and you should never find yourself in this position, because they will lose. They will never regain trust again, right? Why should we trust in what they say if it literally contradicts in a Russellian way what they're actually doing? Because then their words lose meaning, right? Meaning is contingent on it being associated with something actually happening or not happening. So it's very, very dangerous to lie. Also on an individual level, right? In terms of our relationships with others. And that's why we shouldn't lie. It's not because it's a priori an immoral thing, because it has this effect on not being able to build bridges. On the other hand, it doesn't mean to say you have to continually point at the thing in which you're acting upon at that time. So looking at the Democrats, right, with the shutdown, right, their focus wasn't always on look what we're doing and look how damaging it's going to be the Republicans in the polls. And that might have been their ultimate goal, and it worked, right? They won those elections. Probably, the shutdown had a big role to play in that. But their rhetoric wasn't in line with that, if that was their intent. And that was very, very clever. I think it was a great example of what I'm talking about, and gives me a lot of hope in the US that Democrats have got their stuff together, shall we say. And understand.
We'll see. That's yet to be proven.
Because going back to your point about what Roosevelt did with regards to the oil embargo, right? In the short term, that created some economic pain for the US, but in the long term, it reduced the long-term economic pain by having a very, very powerful Japan that didn't lose the Second World War. So it's this kind of hardline position. Sometimes you can really see their effects by taking them earlier rather than later, because the later you leave it, the more painful it's going to be. And I think that's probably something we can learn from Roosevelt here, and hopefully will become applied in terms of the leaderships of our countries. But in the meantime, we've got China owning a port in Greece, and I don't think at this point there's much Europe can do about what's already owned by China, and then they need to sadly work with. I mean, because of this trust and honesty thing, right? What other nation's going to work with a European nation if they just suddenly randomly seize Chinese assets in Europe? And in the Russian case, that makes a lot of sense, because they've acted in such an untrustworthy way that all previous agreements are kind of off the table, and I think that's a fair point. But I don't think China.
With Russia at this point, it's like I, just to go back to the conversation that we started with, I wouldn't even. I know a lot of people call Russia a fascist state. I don't even. I wouldn't call them that. It's just a mob. It is literally just like it's a criminal organization. It's not really ideological.
So you don't
It really is. It's
you don't want to be
Putin is the
insulting
mob
to you
boss.
don't want to be insulting to fascism by calling Russia a fascist state.
Exactly. I don't want
They're
to
that bad.
degrade fascism by raising Russia to that level. Um, no, but it's just a mob state. So it's like, how can you deal with like just from a practical standpoint? It's like, no, you guys are totally justified and in cutting Russia off of everything, and you should be. Those who haven't, shame on you for not cutting it off now, because you're dealing with Putin's just a mob boss. There's a great foreign policy article. Chris, fuck, I forget his last name. That talks about Russian the Russian gulag prison culture and its effect on government now. It's very, very great. I recommend whoever's listening to look it up. Um, it's fascinating, just like how their government is just pretty much structured as just like as like a mob. So think of like in the United States, the
Mhm.
mafia, or like some Sicilian mobster, or like Sicilian crime family. It is. It's almost a one-to-one.
Well, hey, let's create a new hybrid. This is mob fascism, right? Because I think actually, if you want to
Don
call
fascista.
if you want to if you want to call China fascist, I think you actually I would argue have to with Russia. It's expansionist. It's got some ethno-nationalism deeply built in. I mean, look what Putin's been writing in terms of like the Slavic peoples.
That's a fair point.
So I think it ticks so many boxes, and it is not. It's not. It's a bit of a false dichotomy to say it has to be either a mob or fascistic state. I think it's mob fascism. I think what I would describe Russia as. And as far as you go, and this it goes back to a point you made earlier, saying, well, there's no state more fascistic in this world than China. I'd say Russia in response to that. And this is one of the reasons why we have to be proportional reciprocity in terms of how we deal with other nations. I would say we shouldn't deal with China as harshly as we deal with Russia. They have still been supplying us chips that have gone into our own weapons that have been then exported to Ukraine, even though they've been doing it to Russia as well. They could have just stopped the flow to Western nations, right?
Well, I mean, just mainly like who's being the more aggressive on the world stage right now? Like, even if Russia was a democracy and they were democratically electing to do all these things, I still think Russia should elicit more of a harsh response than China, even if China is in that case more authoritarian, more fascist, and more
I think it's such a.
ideologically evil.
I can't even imagine Russia as a democracy.
Well, I'm saying this is an absurd fucking hypothetical. I'm talking about something as strange as Martians landing on Earth, and the
You've got an
right
amazing
now saying that.
imagination.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, it's mainly like what merits so much of the animosity right now is what Russia's doing.
It's not just what Russia's doing, it's the immense dishonesty by which they're doing it. And it goes back to the fact that they even dare call themselves a democracy. At least China doesn't call itself a democracy. China roughly, represents what a system is by what it says and by what it does, give or take. Compared to Russia, it's almost like whatever Russia says is the opposite. It couldn't be a worse and most untrustworthy theoretical partner. And that's why it doesn't really matter what we've promised to them, because it's all those promises are lost now, right? And it goes deep into how
they're the best example of what I'm worried about with Trump, with the way that we've been treating our international relations. They've taken that to the end. That is the end state of nobody can fucking trust you because you never speak the truth.
I mean, maybe this is a good endpoint, but this goes back to Plato's political philosophy, right? Because he said after democracy, you get oligarchy. And I think Russia had democracy for a few months in the 1990s and was already laying the groundwork by the end of the 1990s for oligarchy, especially once these oligarchs started buying up the state assets. Whereas in the US, you've had quite a long period of democracy, but there is a risk that you're falling into oligarchy. And I can't remember all the minutiae and the details of how Plato argued this cycle between political systems, but it seems uncannily similar to what's happening in the US with the likes of Musk having its incredible power, concentration of power on an individual. with his fingers in so many pies, an effective oligarch in the US. And not even effective, he is an oligarch in the US. And that relationship between leadership and oligarchy. So I really wonder what that relationship will look like under a democratic leadership. Will they try and still woo these people? Are they going to say, hey, what the hell were you doing with the last leadership? That's not on. I mean, can they even do that?
I view someone like Musk as like a national security threat at this point. It's
yeah, for sure, because
like
he's an
that's an
oligarch.
argument
Yeah.
I've been making with some more right-wing people, is that people like Musk, people like there's a class now in the United States that you can't, that I think exceeds, like when people think of like the Gilded Age in the United States with the robber baron era and the when we had those major monopolies in the really early 1900s, late 1800s, that Teddy Roosevelt, one of the great goats of American presidents, even if he was a little imperialist, you gotta take the good and the bad of Teddy Roosevelt. He had a lot of good, but he did have some bad baggage with him too. Um, but you compare that to that era, you'd have like a Rockefeller who would control towns or counties, would just be his like personal fiefdoms. But something that Rockefeller couldn't do is go to a foreign state and say, hey, I'm just going to turn off your military satellite equipment and communications. That kind of leverage is kind of new in American politics, where you're having individuals with that kind of non-state actor power, because Musk is effectively a non-state actor. And that's fucking dangerous. It's just like,
he's one step away from being a terrorist, actually, if you think about it.
It really is, yeah. And it's just like, as much as I do not prescribe to certain economic classes are inherently evil or bad or must be removed.
Completely agree.
I find the economic class arguments usually to be very misguided at best. But with Musk, it's not because he has a lot of wealth. It's because of how much he has and how he uses it. It's like, Jesus Christ, you're a de facto non-state actor and you act like it, and that's what makes you so dangerous.
I mean, I push back a little bit on that. I do think that when you have such a, I mean, I think in terms of probability distribution, so hey, I'm a statistical physicist, is the way I think. And I think about the distribution of wages in the US and how broad it's become. I think it in itself is a problem. But I don't blame the billionaires for being billionaires. If I had the possibilities to be in the position they're in, I would probably do the same. And then you also have different reactions to being billionaires, right? So like lumping them all in as either bad or good is nonsensical. But of course, when they're bad, their effect is insane. And that's why one of the reasons why it's so dangerous. You only need one of them to go bad for it to have a horrendous effect. And not just on the US, because of course, Musk has more money than most countries in the world, right?
Well, yes and no. And that's one of the things that I hate most about Musk, is that how many of that class, their wealth is this speculative bullshit. Like the value's there, but the liquidity isn't, and that's what annoys me with Musk.
Just to push back on that, Gates apparently sold the majority of his shares in Microsoft recently. I mean, they can. Of course, that's about what value means with a currency, right?
Yeah, but Musk can't do that. That's the thing, is Musk can't do what Bill Gates did, because his wealth is tied to hyper speculative companies.
Okay, but let's say he did it with 20% of its wealth. That's still a sizable amount, right? He could get away with that. So I mean,
but I don't know if he could legally sell 20% of his Tesla stocks. I don't know. I think that would crash Tesla's evaluation, wipe out his speculative wealth. And
yeah, I mean, it depends on the rate at which you do it and such like. But you think that with Microsoft,
Musk
right?
is a weird case. Let's just put it that way. Musk is kind of a weird case if you're looking at American billionaires. Jeff Bezos is probably a better example for what you're talking about.
And he's not. I don't know how much better he is, but he seems to be very Machiavellian. I mean, the way he seems to flip sides.
He's less bombastic, and Bezos doesn't seem to be malicious like Musk. Musk generally seems to have gone through mental psychosis. My pet theory is that during the I think it was 2019 or 2017. I think 2019. During the there's a period when they're trying to build a gigafactory in Texas, I believe, or New Mexico. I forget where it was. But it was being lauded that he spent like a month where he was sleeping maybe like 3 or 4 hours a week. And there's all these pictures, and that was his PR team saying, see how hard he's working. But I think what came out of that was that he used a lot of fucking drugs to work these insane hours. And I think we're at the end state of that drug use that started then.
Yeah.
And
I mean, we
I
have
don't
to
know.
be
Musk is
careful
a
about
hard person to characterize.
speculation, but I mean,
That's why I said it's my pet theory, because
he does
like
seem a very damaged individual compared to say 10 years ago, and I don't know.
because you think of like when he started with his entrepreneurial things. Like I think SpaceX is a great example. He was Musk is not as involved as his marketing makes him out to be for how SpaceX is run, designed, and operated. He can be given credit for two major things with SpaceX. One was the kind of very succinct, direct vision of what was guiding the company, because he did have one, and that's better than a lot of companies in aerospace right now, which is very ambiguous in what their vision is. The other thing that he did, and was a useful skill he used to have, this is a skill he does not seem to have anymore, was being very good at selecting people to take technical or systemic leadership roles. So like Shotwell, the COO, the chief operating officer in SpaceX. She is the reason why SpaceX is the way it is. She's the organizational, systemic, and operational genius behind SpaceX.
So that's a bit of an analogy
If,
with a sports team and a manager who's good at choosing its players. So they don't even have to be good at the strategy per se, but if they can choose the right players and maybe the right coaching
yes,
staff,
and
then
that's what Musk was very good at.
Mm.
And I don't think he's very good at that anymore. I think a lot what he's doing right now is running off of the success of what he built with. He fills himself with sycophants and surrounds himself with sycophants now.
I think it's even scarier. I think, and now we're in the realms of speculation, but it's also interesting.
100%. Disclaimer: this is speculative bullshit.
He has so much power with his money that it's inevitable that power will almost self-maintain because of how countries will react to him in terms of the potential of him investing with that money in their country. But also, I do wonder if he's being propped up by other nations. When you look at his shift in politics, it's very much aligned with this far right politic that's very destructive towards Western democracies. And I don't know if you read my article a few weeks ago about how the Soviet Union's had active measures propping up far right parties in Europe with the intention of destroying Western democracies. And of course, if there's a continuity of that, Putin himself was likely directly involved in that in the 1980s, and so therefore knows about how effective these active measures are. And so it's likely that Russia is continuing this procedure of funding far right parties in Western democracies. And Trump, that's an interesting slip. Musk aligning with that politics seems far too much of a coincidence, which suggests that he may be supported, kind of insured by, could be Russia, could even be China. Of course, he has a lot of business interests in China, so there may be some ugly symbiosis going on there, which is kind of an interesting thing to come back onto, given the topic today. Yeah, I'll let you get to your work, because I think we've been speaking for 2 hours now, and and it's a good place to round up maybe with this cycle of thinking about how Musk is corrupted and how that might relate to Chinese power. But it's been we should do this again. There's a whole. I would also like to hear more about your expertise in your own sector as an engineer. Because you have fascinating things to talk about, and perhaps we can reflect on one of your articles that you write for the Pragmatic Papers, because you've written 2 good articles now. It's always a joy to read what you have to write. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate this, especially given how early in the morning it must be for you. And
it's 8 a.m. now, so it's better.
Well, I hope the coffee is strong enough. I mean, if you're into caffeine, but have a great rest of the day, and thank you for jumping on stream. And we should do it again at some point in the future. Yep.
And, 100%. And shout out to Pragmatic Papers. Please read.
Yeah, exactly.
It's good for you.
Yeah, and also anyone.
In fact, stop listening to us right now and read something.
No. Before they stop, you should like, comment, and subscribe. We have to go through this rigmarole of saying that, but people forget, and so maybe it's helpful to say that. But exactly. Go and read our articles. We should have a new edition coming out any day now, and I've seen some of the articles that are ready to come out, and it's going to be another great edition. So. I'm really excited to read the other articles in that edition myself. So have a great
in the meantime, I'll give you one thing. I sent you a fun article, another thing from Dr. Rudd.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah.
It's really great. Anyway, I'm a big fan of Dr. Ed. I like the way he thinks. But anyways, I should get going now. You have a great one, man. It was great talking to you. And
Thank you.
let's
Yeah.
do this again next time.
Likewise. Yeah.